When discussing the most intense moments in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis certainly ranks among the top. This 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The year is 1962. For over a year, the U.S. and Cuba have been engaged in a standoff of sorts. And much to the surprise of the U.S., they discovered that the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles on the island. For the U.S., this was an unacceptable situation. But before the operation was completed, Kennedy received a letter from the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. In it, Khrushchev proposed an agreement where the U.S. would remove its missiles from Turkey in exchange for the removal of the Cuban missiles. The removal of the missiles had to be verified by the UN. Then the Americans in Cuba had to be withdrawn. Finally, a quarantine of the island would be established to prevent future conflicts. Did Kennedy make the right call by agreeing to the deal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the series in the description. Thanks for watching. All in all, it was a risky move, but it paid off. By October, the crisis had passed and the world could breathe a little easier. While this may seem like a simple solution, it was far from that. The decisions made by Kennedy and Khrushchev could have resulted in a nuclear holocaust. But instead, they chose to take a less aggressive approach, and ultimately the world was a safer place because of it. The American public had no idea about the deal that was struck. Had they known, there would have likely been an uproar. That's because the U.S. had deployed missiles to Turkey in 1960. But at the time, the placement of these missiles was kept secret. By agreeing to remove these missiles, the U.S. was making a significant concession without the public knowing about it. If the Soviets were allowed to keep these missiles, then they would have a much shorter and much easier path to launching a nuclear strike on the American mainland. And secondly, it prevented the possible loss of countless lives that a full-scale war could have caused. But there was also a third reason that played heavily into Kennedy's decision, and that was the Bay of Pigs. As I mentioned earlier, the Bay of Pigs was an attempt by the CIA to overthrow Fidel Castro. The problem was that it failed. Not only did the invasion fail, but it also became a propaganda boom for the communists around the world. In other words, the Bay of Pigs was a huge embarrassment for the U.S. And Kennedy didn't want his first major crisis to be defined by two failed operations, so he agreed to the deal. Now, there's one thing you should know about the U.S. during this time period. They did not take kindly to being outsmarted. As such, President John F. Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, otherwise known as the XCOM, to determine what action should be taken. In April of 1961, a group of Cuban exiles trained and funded by the CIA had attempted to invade the island nation. This plan involved a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. However, this option was quickly discounted as it carried the risk of starting a full-scale nuclear war. A more measured response would be to blockade the island of Cuba and prevent any further shipments from coming in. This would send a strong message to the Soviets, while also giving the U.S. time to formulate a better long-term strategy. It seems like the logical move, right? Well, it was actually closer to being implemented than you may have thought. Naturally, this invasion was doomed from the start. But more importantly, it made the already tense relationship between Cuba and the U.S. even worse. To make matters even more difficult, the Soviet Union had aligned itself with Cuba after this failed invasion. But what if it didn't have to be this way? What if the Cuban Missile Crisis could have been avoided entirely? Let's find out. It's me. Welcome to this channel. And today we're asking, could the Cuban Missile Crisis have been avoided? As tensions continued to rise, American spy planes began photographing Cuba. Now there were several options on the table. One of the more extreme options was Operation Pluto. In fact, the U.S. Navy began carrying out this blockade on October 24, 1962. But why did Kennedy agree to the deal? There are a couple reasons. First and foremost, it diffused a very tense situation. However, there were still some final hurdles to overcome. Today, the Cuban Missile Crisis is looked back upon as one of the scariest moments in human history. Do you think the Cuban Missile Crisis could have been avoided?